And we're live. Hiya, folks. Nice to see you again. My name's Dustin Cormier, and welcome to How to Rock Astrology. Today we're going to be continuing our reading of Stephen Arroyo's Astrology Karma and Transformation. We are now on the chapter regarding the transits of Saturn. Excuse me. Welcome into the deepest, darkest parts of your own psyche. We've been talking about Saturn and all this throughout this whole series, and now we're getting to something that's very juicy, and to be honest with you, probably constitutes the heart of this book. In fact, if you look up this book on Amazon, I find that many of the things that people talk about in regards to praise for this book is the section of this book discussing Saturn in transit, which we're about to read today. And in particular, we're going to get into Saturn's transit through the houses. So stay tuned for that, because it's going to be a good one. But for now, building up towards it, this section on the transits of Saturn is also juicy as well. It gives us the proper way to understand Saturn and its cycles. So, as usual, this is a live stream, ladies and gentlemen. So if you feel like asking any questions, making any comments, I'll speak to your questions, comments, and concerns as befits the nature of our discussion today. So let's get on with it. This is The Transits of Saturn by Stephen Arroyo. Throughout many occult and religious traditions, great emphasis has been placed on 7-year cycles in relation to physical growth, psychological development, world events, and spiritual evolution. The Edgar Cayce psychic readings are filled with references to these 7-year cycles, especially in relation to health problems. According to these readings, human beings can change most conditions that they truly desire to change, physically, mentally, and spiritually, within a cycle of 7 years. It's almost like, there's Kundalini yogis like Yogi Bhajan that talk about these kinds of cycles where it does take a set amount of time to completely obliterate the karmic samskaras of this or that life activity, if you dedicate enough time to really hacking at it in that way. So if the Cayce readings are as accurate in this idea as they have proven to be in many other areas, then there's apparently almost no limit to the renewal and regeneration that can be accomplished by an individual on all levels of being. A few quotes from Cayce's readings can serve to illustrate his approach to these cycles. And I quote, let me go into these little quotations here. "For have ye not heard how that constantly there is the change, and that the body has in a 7-year cycle reproduced itself entirely? No need for anyone, then, to have any disturbance over that length of period, if, by common sense, there would be the care taken. But if your mind holds to it, and you've got a stumped toe, it will stay stumped. If you've got a bad condition in your gizzard or your liver, you'll keep it, if you think so. But the body, the physical, the mental, and spiritual, will remove same, if ye will let it, and not hold to the disturbance." Very psychedelic thought. That was reading number 257-259. A quote continues further. "Were an anatomical or pathological study made for a period of 7 years, which is a cycle of change in all the body elements, of one that is acted upon through the third eye alone, we will find one fed upon spiritual things become a light that may shine from and in the darkest corner. One fed upon the purely material will become a Frankenstein that is without a concept of any influence other than material or mental. That was reading number 262, -20. Very psychedelic way of just thinking about reframing and developing on the personality instincts in general. That's how it works, is these consecutive attitude implications. If you really find out, you read a self-help book and you really start working out what you have to do in order to change your personality, and you start whittling away at your constant activity day by day, after about 7 years, if you really stick to one thing, you'll dissolve a lot. Although, hopefully you would have also started to move around towards finding the self-realization of what is a worthy will to hold on to. That's also important. But this is just showing that the neuroplasticity of our samskaras, of the things we grip and hold on to, which is very important and wonderful to have a sense of. So even such conditions as muscular strains need not be expected to be cured in a day, a week, a month, or a year. It requires 7 years for resuscitation, change, or eliminations. It's from reading number 1710-10. Last quote. Here we find the necessity for care, for exercise, for constant checking up on the bodily activities. The body physical alters in its expression continually, and by the end of a cycle of 7 years, it has entirely replaced that which existed at the beginning of the period 7 years ago. Or replaced with what? The same old tendencies multiplied, the same old inclinations doubled, or those old tendencies eradicated. So that was reading number 2533-6. And now Stephen Arroyo continues in his own word. Another more modern reference to 7-year cycles, and these 7-year cycles relate to Saturn, by the way. You're going to understand what this is coming from when you start to see that it takes Saturn 28 years to cycle back to its natal point. So that means that what's 28 divided by 4 is 7. So every 7 years, Saturn is either in a square or an opposition or a square from whatever point you're counting it from. Let's say, when Saturn transits a planet, it's not like this annoying thing and it's like, oh, thank God Saturn's no longer conjunct that planet, right? If Saturn conjuncts your moon, which is something called sati sati, it's an important Vedic concept that we're going to talk about probably at the end of this episode, I believe. Yes, I've got it in here somewhere. Let's say when Saturn goes over top of your moon and it comes to conjunct, let's say your moon is at 15 degrees of Capricorn, comes conjunct the moon, and then eventually it's 10 degrees away, eventually it gets to 25 degrees of Capricorn, and then eventually it's the second house from the moon, and it's completely gone away. When Saturn is moving through these places, that conjunction is actually just the beginning of a 28-year period where Saturn is going to wrap all the way around it. The themes that happen when Saturn transits conjunct a planet are going to be unfolded in 14 years and then resolved in another 14 years. And every 7 years there's going to be a dramatic event that signals the progress of Saturn's resolution of the karmas related to that planet. That was my spiel on what the heck is this 7 years thing all about. Now let's continue Stephen Arroyo's word. So another more modern reference to 7-year cycles by a non-astrologer is found in the research of Dr. Daniel J. Levinson. Dr. Levinson is a professor of psychology at Yale School of Medicine. And he presented his thesis of life cycles at a symposium sponsored by the Menninger Foundation. In his conclusions, Levinson finds that no life structure can last longer than 7 or 8 years. Since Levinson is a psychologist, his calculations were based on the psychological development of hundreds of people studied over a period of years. So that really says a lot. In fact, it's interesting that anybody who would have come to Levinson for this kind of study that Levinson was doing, they were probably coming to him and developing on changes in themselves, and Levinson marked throughout 7 years that it would take 7 or 8 years to make a transformation from the first time they came to Dr. Levinson. Now the question is why did they come to Dr. Levinson? Probably because Saturn conjuncted an important part in their chart, and it took 7 years to get to the square where they would be tested and checked and shown the resolution of the thing, right? So, I mean, just being 7 years ahead of that conjunction is not going to fix it. But, maybe people came when Saturn was at the 3rd square from a planet. Let's say if Mars is in Capricorn and Saturn is transiting Libra, and they came to Dr. Levinson and they needed to figure out something related to Mars. 7 years later, it comes to the conjunction, and it's resolving what's been happening and saying the new place. Saturn now being conjunct Mars in a new series of lessons, a new strata of gripping Mars. Anyway, I digress. I guess I just wanted to say what the reference is to the 7-year thing. So Dr. Levinson's findings were used as a primary source by Gail Sheehy in her best-selling book, Passages, Predictable Crises in Adult Life. In this book, after interviewing hundreds of people concerning their state of mind and their personal values at various stages of life, she outlines certain life periods that seem more often than not to be times of crucial choices, changes, and rapid development. It will not surprise most astrologers that these various ages, found through interviews and research to be significant times of life for most people, coincide with the approximate periods of life when transiting Saturn is conjunct, square, or opposite its natal place. And I can see that Stephen Arroyo is making a huge emphasis on the age of 7, the age of 14, the age of 21, and the age of 28, and then the same 7-year periods after that. Because that's Saturn actually being in phases from its natal place, which is the very place that we have such difficulty with in life, coming from our past lives. If one were to combine the square and opposition of transiting Uranus to its natal place with the Saturn transits, one would have an even more complete and accurate outline of the major change periods in most people's lives than even Sheehy has found. So, Arroyo, I've read this too, that Uranus's squares and oppositions to its natal place is also deeply significant to these life periods. Uranus, I believe at its halfway point, signals the midlife crisis as it goes. So this is, of course, nothing new to astrologers, these cycles of time. In 1940, Grant Louis published his book, Astrology for the Millions, which pioneered into a better understanding of the Saturn cycle. In that book, Louis clearly outlined the very transition or passage age periods, which readers of Sheehy's book are now heralding as an important psychological discovery. In addition, Carl Gustav Jung pointed out many years ago that most important psychological crises were accompanied by transits of either Saturn or Uranus. I do not, however, Stephen says, I do not, however, want to belittle the work that Levinson and Sheehy has done, for anything that further introduces the concept of life cycles into the awareness of the general public is a positive trend. And in fact, I feel that astrologers can benefit from reading Sheehy's book, since it clearly shows how men and women tend to react a bit differently during the various crucial periods, the awareness of which might lead the astrological counselor to emphasize certain facets of experience during a specific transit with women and other areas with men. Sheehy, in fact, often expresses the experiential meaning of these crucial phases of life very clearly. And this is from one of her books. Does it say which book? Is that Sheehy's book? Right. Her best-selling book, Passages, Predictable Crises in Adult Life. That's where these come from. So, and I quote, "We are not unlike a particularly hardy crustacean. The lobster grows by developing and shedding a series of hard protective shells. Each time it expands from within, the confining shell must be sloughed off. It is left exposed and vulnerable until, in time, a new covering grows to replace the old. With each passage from one stage of human growth to the next, we, too, must shed a protective structure. We are left exposed and vulnerable, but also yeasty and embryonic again, capable of stretching in ways we hadn't known before." What a great, that's awesome. Yeasty. "The illusions of the 20s, however, may be essential to infuse our first commitments with excitement and intensity, and to sustain us in those commitments long enough to gain us some experience in living." That all comes from Passages, Predictable Crises in Adult Life by Gail Sheehy. Now, if you guys don't mind, I just want to write something down real quick. A personal note to myself, because I do that. You guys just witnessed what so many people in my life have to witness when I'm doing anything. If I have to write down a note, it's like, "Oh, hi everybody, I'll just be right back." My whole life is notes. Personal notes to myself. Now, if any readers are unfamiliar with the general meaning of the conjunctions, squares, and oppositions of transiting Saturn to its natal place, I refer them to Lewi's, Till's, and Robertson's books on the same subject. Again, I would consider that Vedic astrology has a different conception for Saturn's aspects in general, and I often speak to them. But as this is a Western reading of a Western author, I'm going to generally keep his word for what he's trying to express in this book. I might just be cheeky once in a while and mention the Vedic way of thinking things differently. But that's, I always say in these videos, it's for the sake of inviting different ways of conceiving of astrology. Since there's so much good material on this topic of these aspects already in print, Stephen Arroyo says, I feel that it is unnecessary to duplicate it here. However, I would like to mention some ideas and key concepts which I have found to be especially useful in counseling and in understanding the various types of Saturn cycles. I do not mean to imply that the transits of Saturn alone should be considered in evaluating important change periods in the individual life. For any astrologer working in an in-depth way, would undoubtedly look at all the transits of the outer 5 planets, important new moons and their aspects, and eclipses in the Vedic sense, and perhaps the progressed sun and moon. We will, however, talk about transits other than Saturn's and also progressions in later chapters in this book. The fact remains, nevertheless, that Saturn's cycles provide us with a particularly complete and useful symbol of human growth, achievement, and maturation. Very complete and useful and important. Saturn's transits to houses and to planets are huge, important aspects. I'm just noticing my friend Ronnie has given us a comment, and I'm assuming that means you're enjoying, Ronnie. I'm glad to hear that, my friend. Saturn is not the only planet of maturation and achievement and spiritual accomplishment and all these things, but it is a particularly poignant, it's kind of like the foundational, Saturn's cycles through anywhere are always a deeply important theme for what's happening in that moment in one's karma. And dealing with whatever's going on with Saturn is going to ripple through everything in one's life. And if you don't deal with Saturn now because you think that Venus or the moon or some other planet is more important, and that's just your relationship with that planet, and you're not pacing yourself or doing what's really necessary regarding that planet, you might be okay with it now, but down the road it might cause you more trouble. That's why whatever house Saturn is transiting is always a necessary part of whatever other thing is going on in your life. Now, continuing on. Traditionally, Saturn is the great teacher, and more so than with the transits of any other planets. Transits of Saturn, especially close conjunctions, squares, and oppositions to natal planets, are often experienced as periods wherein we are being taught specific lessons about life. In some cases, this experience prompts people to say such things as, "It's as if Saturn were speaking to me, whispering in my ear, telling me what I now have to do in order to outgrow this present condition that is beginning to feel so confining and frustrating." I've had this myself in my darker, hard Saturn moments, more particularly when I was going through my sati. It's a Vedic term, which we're going to talk about at the end of this Transiting Saturn series. I was going through, Saturn was transiting conjunct my natal moon. And I have always kind of had spiritual leanings, shall we say, and it's in this particular time that I was really having a deep experience of being spoken to by what I call Divine Mother, divine guidance, the divine teachers within me. I got messages, I got transcriptions from extraterrestrial data agents who are invested in my corporeal state, who said that you've got to let go of these things that are not serving you for the sake of the betterment of the universe. And I really felt like I was experiencing, not through a voice, but just through some kind of transmission. So I'm a spiritual guy, and I kind of got that experience from myself. But I think psychologically, psychospiritually, metaphysically, we can put it that I was expanding towards the walls of the universe, and the walls of the universe were echoing back, saying that we're the wall, the metaphysical gate, the Saturn of your life is going to confine your expansion in this material realm if you don't expand the walls beyond your inflating self, your expanding self. And the Divine Mother transmission that I'm talking about, Saturn whispering in your ear, is like the feedback of the expanding vessel to the wall, saying it's getting too small in here and we've got to contract and somehow make a bigger womb or be birthed into a new womb, etc. So any transit of the outer 5 planets in close aspect to natal planets, that's the Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, in close aspect to natal planets, can be experienced as getting messages from these living gods. The energies of the outer planets are often experienced more as impulses or as compulsions. Although, whereas, as we read, Saturn is often experienced as the archetypal teacher, whose lessons carry great weight and importance. I remember when Saturn transitioned in opposition to my natal Mercury quite a few years ago. This is Stephen Arroyo speaking. Quite a few years ago, Saturn transitioned in opposition to my natal Mercury. It was a period of profound learning, as if I were being instructed very deliberately and systematically by some higher power who knew exactly what I needed to learn and who would not alleviate the mental pressure I felt until I had paid sufficient attention to his lessons. At times, the mental pressure became so intense that I felt like I was going to explode from all the incredibly profound insights I was being given. Saturn's influence is always felt as an urge to make things definite and concrete, and so I felt the need to write down what I was being shown. The result was that by the time this transit passed, about a month later, I had accumulated pages and pages of notes to which I referred many times for guidance during confusing periods in my life. Although many books predict a time of mental depression during Saturn's transit of Mercury, it was for me a time of profound and inspiring revelation. Probably says something to the positive placement of Mercury in Stephen Arroyo's chart. The point I am trying to make here is that one can, by opening oneself to Saturn's superior objectivity and wisdom, tune in on very precise and specific lessons about how one is approaching life during the major transits of Saturn. Now, so that was fun. That was about a half an hour. Hope you guys enjoyed that. I see we have 4 or 5 viewers still currently watching. Thank you for being a part of this reading experience today. We're still going. Believe me, folks, honestly, this is going to be a late one. I'm expecting to be going until like midnight today. If you want to come for the ride, please do. Feel free. Welcome to my life. Having like so much fixed energy. I'm Leo rising. I got Sun, Mars, Pluto in Scorpio, and Saturn in Aquarius. And that's how I like it. So, we've talked about Saturn in transit. We're continuing this conversation. In the next video, we're going to focus on the meaning, the interpretation, and the philosophical epithet that is Saturn Return. If anybody is around my age and you're reading this, this might be some juicy stuff for you to listen to. I'm excited to go through it myself. Right now, Saturn is retrograde in Capricorn. Once it's finished with its retrograde this year, it's going to blast through the gates and go way past Saturn in Aquarius. Way past the Aquarius. And my natal Saturn is in 0 degree, like 1 degree of Aquarius. So Saturn is going to be passing over in transit in a few months. Saturn is going to pass over my natal transit, my natal Saturn. And I'm going to experience the Saturn return. So I'm really excited to read about this. And that's like what Saturn return means. We're going to talk about it all in my next episode. For those watching, we'll take 2 minutes. Let's get together at 7:10 p.m.